Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we will explore one of the biggest battles of the Second World War, the Battle of Berlin. The dramatic culmination of 4 years of war on the Eastern Front, which ended the Third Reich and also set the stage for the Cold War in Europe. Looking at the spring of 1945, it is really quite amazing to see that this battle actually did take place, because by April, the war was practically lost. Germany had very, very clearly lost the war. And one of the big questions that we're going to explore in a bit more depth and detail later on is this question as to why the Germans were actually still fighting. But more of this a little bit later. Let's look at the strategic situation, the spring of 1945, very, very briefly. So perhaps let's start with the Western Front and this whole question as to why it was the Soviets and not the Western Allies that got to Berlin. Because when you look at what goes on the Western Front, by that stage, the last natural frontier, the Rhine, had been broken, had been breached, had been crossed by the Western Allies. They are pouring into Germany, Northern Germany and Western Germany. Perhaps the most important battle and the best known battle, or even perhaps you might say it's a campaign, it's much bigger than a battle that's being fought at that particular time in April 1945, is the battle for the Ruhr Pocket, the industrial heartland of Germany, where the entire German industrial heartland is encircled by the British and American forces, and the German army basically, after a bit of fighting, completely surrenders. And it's also very obvious that in the West, on the whole, there are always exceptions to this particular rule, of course, but on the whole, the Germans are not fighting that hard anymore. They realize the war is being lost, and they're quite happy to surrender now, something that hadn't really happened before. So why do these troops, why do these armies not just push all across Germany and try to seize Berlin as quickly as possible? Well, there is a strategic idea behind, a strategic reason, and it's all the result of the Conference of Yalta, which had been held between the 4th and the 11th of February, where the future victorious powers get together and they basically decide about the restructuring of Germany, cutting up Germany, having occupational zones. And at that stage, it's very, very clear, if the Americans had pushed on to Berlin and conquer all of central Germany, they would have had to cede all that territory to the Soviets, because that was very firmly in the Soviet occupational zone as decided during Yalta. There are some examples of big cities that the Americans managed to seize, like, for example, Leipzig, which in the summer of 1945, they then hand over to the Soviets. So really, the Western forces are slowing their troops down, giving the Soviets the chance, the ability to invade and to attack and to seize Berlin, the capital of Germany. So, Jesse, I know you know an awful lot about the Battle of Berlin, the Eastern Front. You've done a lot of documentaries on that. You've actually written a book about this. So talk us through what actually happens on the Eastern Front, closer to Berlin itself.
You're too kind, Matthias, as usual. I have had the pleasure of working with this fascinating topic before. In fact, the Berlin Operation, as the Soviets call it, is not only one of the largest single battles of the Second World War, it is, by many accounts, the largest single battle to ever take place on German territory, on German soil. So that makes it all the more compelling as one of the most dramatic stories right at the end of the Second World War. As you say, the outcome of the war is not particularly in doubt, except perhaps for a few delusional fanatics within the German ranks and within the Nazi Party. But nonetheless, it's a complex operation, and it's not that simple for the Soviets. I have to say that working with this topic gave me a new appreciation of the bitterness of the fighting, but also of the challenges faced by the Red Army at this stage of the war. It's not a mindless juggernaut that is not facing its own challenges. They did have some success. Not only, as you mentioned, was the Rhine crossed, the natural barrier of the Rhine crossed in the West by the Americans, British, and Canadians in early 1945, but the Soviets launch in January an offensive the Vistula-Oder offensive. Now, Vistula is a big river that's today in Poland, and the Oder is a significant river just about 60 kilometers east of Berlin, so about 40 miles for our imperial system using listeners. And the Soviet Red Army pierces the German front in this area and actually manages to cross the Oder River and establish small and fragile bridgeheads, but they're not strong enough to push and take Berlin in February, say, for example, because there's a huge salient. So they sent these forces all the way, get a small bridgehead across the Oder at the end of January, beginning of February, but it's completely exposed. Their logistics haven't caught up, so they need time. They need time to eliminate the German forces in Pomerania, German province of, or mostly former German province of Pomerania in the north. And then, of course, there's heavy fighting also south and in Hungary on the Eastern Front. So what you have by the spring, by March, April, is a Red Army that is close to Berlin, but really needs to take a breather and build up its forces. And in fact, although, as you explained, the Western Allies don't plan to try to take Berlin, there are a few commanders who would have liked to, and there were a few estimates of could it be done with paratroopers, what would it cost in terms of casualties and so on. The leadership, Eisenhower and Truman and so on, they're against this. So the problem from the Soviet point of view is that you can never trust these bourgeois imperialist allies that you have, right? So Stalin is still suspicious that the Western Allies are going to try something. So they move up the start date. Originally, they are going to start the Berlin operation in May. They shove the start date all the way back to April 16th. And I mean, you're talking reorganizing 29 armies. Now, a Soviet army is a little bit smaller than a German or a Western army. It's more like a corps, but you're still talking a huge amount of people. I think they get together in the 3 army groups that the Soviets organize for this operation. They've got 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. 2 of those armies, by the way, are Polish, under Soviet command, of course. So you have this huge logistical operation across this ruined landscape of former Eastern Germany and Poland, and they're ready to go. And they're in a rush. And this is going to have an impact on the style of fighting and the difficulties that the Soviets face. It's this mistrust of the Allies and sometimes mistrust between Soviet commanders, which is something we'll get into in a moment as well. So all sorts of different moving parts are coming together in advance on the cusp, let's say, of this final offensive. On the German side as well, they have all sorts of ideas about what might happen, but there's a fair bit of chaos, isn't there?
Well, there is an awful lot of chaos, and this chaos already starts before the battle for Berlin starts. You talked about the Vistula-Oder campaign, and even there you can see the German army, the German high command in particular. So Hitler now really doesn't understand what goes on and what the reality is. So before the Vistula-Oder campaign, Hitler gets the news and the daily briefings from the German intelligence service, and they say, well, there's a huge buildup of forces here, and so we really need to counteract and do something about this. And he just says, well, that can't be. They don't have that many tanks. They can't have that many people left. And he says, well, this is the biggest bluff since Genghis Khan, which is quite an interesting one, because then a few days later, the Germans are, of course, hit by the huge offensive, made worse by the fact that then on the 24th of January, they put Himmler in charge of the army group Vistula. He, of course, is not a military man. It's completely bonkers. So he was a chicken farmer, as people say. Of course, he's also the head of the Gestapo. He's the head of the police, all these things, but he's not a military man. So very, very quickly and rapidly, they realize he's not good enough. And on the 21st of March, he gets sacked. So again, it's the build up to this whole thing. You can see how the Germans in the high command have completely lost the plot. And that is the big problem that you find at that stage. And also then when they start planning for the defense of Berlin. Because the big problem that you find here is that they're not really planning at all. They've left everything far too late. And there are a number of reasons for that. The most important reason is probably propaganda. So in the autumn of 1944, the Germans call for the Volkssturm. So this is the group of very young and very old men. You might have seen it on TV, normally walking around just with an armband, no uniform, quite often equipped with one Panzerfaust or a very, very old rifle with 2 or 3 rounds, hardly any military training. So basically, this is cannon fodder. And this is formed in the autumn of 1944. The term Volkssturm goes back to the ideas of the German wars of liberation in the early 19th century. So to Germans at that time, it meant something. They could understand and relate to this and understand why this was important. What had worked to a degree in the early 19th century, rising up against Napoleon, now didn't work at all. So you do have that group, but you don't really want to mobilize everybody to send them to the front line at this stage. You also don't want to evacuate too many people that are still left in the city. So Berlin, before the outbreak of the war, is a city of round about 4.3 million people in the summer of 1939. By early 1945, this had already been dropped to about 2.7 million. A number of reasons for that. First of all, evacuations. You have the bombing campaign. You have lots of men, of course, being moved to the front lines. So about 2/3 of these people still in Berlin are women, children, and old men. A lot of these now being drafted into the Volkssturm. So the last thing you want to do is spread panic and say, we now need to mobilize, we now have to get ready for the big fight because the Russians, the Soviets, are coming. And this only changes on the 20th of April. This is when Clausewitz is given out. Famous Clausewitz, the great German military thinker. Here it means that this is the code word for Berlin becoming a front city. And suddenly everything changes. But this obviously is far too late. And when you look at the real plans that the Germans had, it's very easy to say that there weren't any plans, any deep plans for defense of Berlin.
Yeah, in fact, I've read some interesting accounts that, there was a certain fatalistic black gallows humor that took hold of some Germans, including civilians, during the later phases of the war. And one of the interesting anecdotes that I came across while working on the topic is that, a lot of the barricades that were put up in Berlin were completely ad hoc. It was rubbish. It was some rubble from destroyed buildings from the Allied bombings. There were streetcars that were wrecked and sort of put to block a street. And so the joke that was going around among some Germans was, yes, these barricades, they're only going to take 10 minutes for the Red Army to break through them, 9 minutes for them to die laughing at it, and 1 minute for them to blast it to Kingdom Come and drive down the street. So I think, the population had a sense that this was not going to go well. And that is also reflected in the reality. As you say, it's completely ad hoc. The command is already in a state of disorganization and chaos. It's going to get much worse when the battle continues. They're actually going to start operating at cross purposes to one another. But they do still have some relatively effective formations. There's a couple of famous Waffen-SS divisions, for example, like Nordland with some Scandinavian volunteers, like the Dutch SS division. A few Frenchmen also from the French SS division will also end up participating, but they're short of everything. They have some regular Wehrmacht troops as well, but they have police units, ad hoc alarm units, as they call them. And of course, they have the Volkssturm, as you mentioned. They also try to take advantage of the landscape, because even if you're inferior, as the Germans were in numbers, and you're inferior in quality, as they also were to the Red Army at this time, despite the Red Army's losses and exhaustion from pushing their men too hard, you can still you can still use the terrain and the landscape as a force multiplier. So the land east of Berlin, where the front line is running on April 16th, when the whole operation kicks off, is to the Germans' advantage, right? There's a lot of forests, there's a lot of rivers, there's a lot of lakes, and there are a lot of swamps. And this is going to be a major advantage for the defender when your opponent, the Soviets, are trying to push through and surround the city. That's kind of the game plan for the Soviets. They have these 3 army groups. They want to send 2 to surround Berlin from the north and from the south. These are under command of some of the most famous Soviet generals, Soviet commanders of the Second World War. Georgy Zhukov is with the First Belarusian Front. He's facing directly west towards Berlin. And then you have Ivan Konev, who has the First Ukrainian Front, not because, as I've read in a few recent newspaper articles, not because it's only Ukrainian soldiers, but because that army group was named when it was fighting in Ukraine. So let's clear up that little mini myth right away. Of course, there were many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, but they were spread out amongst all the different Soviet units. So when they are trying to rush tank armies around and surround Berlin, they're going to run into these swamps. They're going to run into these forests, and it's going to be a problem. So that's one advantage that the Germans have. They also are trying to hold the high ground on the banks of the Oder. So yes, the Soviets have one small bridgehead, but they're going to need to storm as part of their main attack in Zhukov's sector. They're going to need to storm high ground called the Seelow Heights. You can visit them today if you're on a European tour and your wife allows it, time-wise. You can go on a tour and check out the Seelow Heights, and you will see it is tactically, locally, a dominant position. So you have this floodplain of the Oder River. It's down low. There are little farms, little houses, little fields. And then you have this 30-meter height that rises up in the center of the German line. And they essentially, because they don't really plan for the defense of the city very well, they essentially stake everything on trying to stop the Soviets on that river line. If the Soviets penetrate, the Germans don't have the fuel, they don't have the vehicles to kind of counter that mobility. They're going to have to send in these emergency units with Panzerfausts, with these handheld anti-tank weapons, to try to take out those spearheads if any of them get through. That, I think, is more or less the operational situation that we're dealing with. The Germans, of course, are outnumbered about 2.5 to 1. So they have about 1 million men, but quite a few of them are not up to snuff, let's say. Before we dive into the operation and how things work and why it takes the Soviets a couple of weeks to do this and how they do it, I wanted us to jump into the topic of motivation, because the war is nearly over, as you correctly pointed out. Most people know the war is nearly over, right? The Germans know it. The Soviets know it. Why are they still going to fight so hard? Why are the Germans going to keep fighting tooth and nail for the city? Most of them anyway. And why are the Soviets going to continue pushing so hard? They don't let up. It's not like they're doing what the Western allies are doing in the West, sort of holding in their horses a little bit, being a little more cautious. They are trying to go full out.
Well, I think you need to look at both sides, of course, as you've just said. So let's start perhaps with the Germans. Absolutely correct. The big question that lots of people have asked, are still debating today, why is Germany not collapsing? Why does the German army keep fighting? Because it's particularly interesting when you compare that to the end of the First World War, where, of course, the German army at that stage is still in enemy territory, Belgium and France, and yet they surrender in November 1918. And in 1945, they really, really fight to the finish, perhaps you might say even beyond the finish in many cases. And I think one of the really crucial points is exactly that link to 1918. Whether it's true or not is a different story, but a lot of people believed in Germany, that Germany had only surrendered in 1918 because of, we talked about this before very briefly, about the stab in the back myth. So Germany was winning, and suddenly, because the socialists, the Jews, the communists, whoever, the Democrats, stabbed the army in the back, and that's why they surrendered. And a lot of people said, particularly military, but also civilians, this will never happen again. And there are lots of debates. There's a famous debate in the Führer bunker just shortly before Hitler commits suicide, where the chief of the general staff and a number of other generals debate what they can still do. And people say, you know what, this is absolutely crazy. And he just burst out and said, well, what do you want us to do? We went through this in 1918. This will never happen to us again. So this time around, we're really going to fight till the end and to the finish. So I think that's the one aspect. The second aspect is that after 12 years of Nazi rule, particularly if you have the younger generation, most of these didn't know anything else but Nazism. And lots of people, being very young, were now being drafted into the army. We already talked about the Volkssturm. You've got the Hitler Youth, famous newsreels, the last newsreel of Hitler, where he gives out medals to the Hitler Youth boys in the Chancellery garden. So these are 12, 13, 14 years old. They haven't seen anything else. And they actually believe that if Nazism falls, if the Führer dies, well, this is going to be the end of absolutely everything. You also have, of course, fear. because this is a Nazi regime. The Nazis killed tens of thousands of their own soldiers, mainly towards the end of the war in the last 2 or 3 months, because they think they're shirkers, they're deserters, and they just put them up on lampposts. And that's a very, very clear sign as why you should continue the fight. Because if you go to the front line, you might get killed. If you run away, you will get killed. So a number of factors coming together here. And of course, another one, which is universal when you look at militaries, it's this whole idea about the small unit cohesion. Who do these people actually fight for? So if you are in a section, a platoon, a company, somewhere on the older front, probably at that stage, some sort of big propaganda speech wouldn't really do much to motivate you. But what does motivate you is this, the small unit cohesion. You're fighting for the people next to you. You don't want to leave them behind. You're one team and you fight and you die together. That really is the important thing. And the Germans were very, very good at this. And this is one of the main reasons why the army doesn't collapse. You also have lots of big social changes in the German army during the Nazi period, because it's National Socialism. The socialist element is very, very big. So you just need to look at how from 1944 onwards, officers were being promoted. It's no longer class-based. It's based on completely different things. It's on how they perform on the battlefield. If you were, for example, in the SS, you were not allowed to have lockers on your cupboards in barracks, because the idea was, well, if you can't trust the comrades back in barracks, how can you trust them when you're out in the field? So this whole idea of unit cohesion was very, very strong, generally speaking, in the German armed forces, probably stronger than in most other armies. And that's an aspect that, of course, also plays a role when you look at the Soviet side. Again, it's the same thing. So you fight for the guys next to you. I think that's really important. You also have the propaganda reason. So you're fighting for Stalin, you're fighting for the motherland. And of course, everybody can see that Berlin is the price. Once you've seized Berlin, the war is going to be over. Of course, you don't want to be the last one to die in this war. That's always the case. But everybody understands that once this city is taken and you've seized all the objectives, that brings the war to an end and everybody can go home. And another motivating factor, of course, on the Soviet side is revenge. That's very, very clear, because the Germans, let's face it, behaved atrociously in the Soviet Union. They killed millions of people. There are accounts by Germans. One famous letter was published, and this German guy says, "Oh my God, I've seen things here. Let's hope we're not going to lose the war, because what will the Soviets do to us to repay what we've done to them?" And that's very, very true. And that was a very, very strong factor. There were a number of propagandists who wrote about this. The most famous one, Ilya Ehrenburg, who wrote about, well, kill the fascist beasts, kill them all, rape as much as you want, loot as much as you want. They deserve everything that they're getting. So I think, again, it's a combination of factors that you get in both camps.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's also my understanding from my experience reading and working with the topic. I want to bring in one small quote because it illustrates, I think, quite well one of the points you just made about this idea that the Germans are motivated also by fear of being punished. So some of the Soviets are motivated by revenge, right? You even have some Soviet units that keep a tally of what all the members of that unit have suffered back home. So how many of their farms have been burned, how many of their relatives have been raped by German soldiers or killed by German soldiers or deported to Germany as slave labor. They'll actually keep tallies in the unit to remind the men, to motivate them about this. And it is a terrible thing. My own partner's grandfather was deported from the East to work as a slave in Germany, and it marks every family member. It's certainly a motivating factor. And a lot of the Germans know this, right? As you say. And one of them who knows it is a soldier. I found this account where there's a 16-year-old and he's at a train station in Berlin shortly before the Berlin operation begins. And there's a big crowd at the train station and people are having different discussions. And there's sort of a bit of a feeling of panic because everyone knows that, the operation has begun or is about to begin. And this soldier, according to this teenaged boy who leaves this account later, the soldier is yelling at his conversation partner and says, "We have to win this war. If the others win the war and they do to us only a fraction of what we have done in the occupied territories, there won't be a single German left in a few weeks." So I think, that kind of encapsulates this fear that the Germans have, which of course is made worse by Soviet behavior at the beginning of, let's say, before the Berlin operation, when they enter East Prussia. They really go nuts, right? There's extreme atrocities and rape and killings. Now, the Red Army then changes its tune propaganda-wise, discipline-wise, and it tries to get a handle on some of those behaviors because they realize they're going to be occupying Eastern Germany after the war, and they don't want to have even more resistance because of fear and resentment on the part of the Germans. Of course, they never fully do get a handle on it, as we will discuss in more detail when we get into the atrocities during the Battle for Berlin. But the German propaganda, of course, makes a huge deal about what happens in East Prussia, and everybody in Berlin knows.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. There's the famous place called Nemmersdorf, which is occupied by the Soviets, as you just rightly said, and then the Germans counterattack and get back in. And the first thing that the Nazis do is send in all the propaganda people to take photos, to film what happened, because the scenes are pretty brutal, pretty awful. And of course, we must forget it's revenge for what the Germans had done in the East. But that's, of course, not how it's sold to the German public back home. And Goebbels talks about, and this is basically, you might say, the best that could have happened to Germany on the whole, because this will really make people fight much, much harder. And the scenes are absolutely gruesome. We don't need to go into detail here, but they're really awful, the stuff that you find there. Just as bad as the stuff was that the Soviets found when they reconquered their territory, to what the Germans had done. But this aspect of fear on the German side is absolutely crucial. I used to remember talking to people, veterans, who said, well, I had 8 bullets in my pistol, 7 were for the Soviets, the last one was for me. So this whole idea of surrendering to the Soviets is nothing that you do, because they are the Red Horde, they're the hordes from the East. And that's a topos, an idea that had been running around for centuries. You even find the same thing in the First World War, you find the same thing in the 7 Years' War. So that is really nothing new. So this fear of the beast in the East is really something that's deeply ingrained in the German psyche.
Right. And then the battle begins. Yeah, and we start off with what I would call the breakthrough phase, or the attempt at a breakthrough phase, which more or less lasts for about 4 days, from April 16th to April 19th. And you have the main action is with the Zhukov and Konev army groups. So the Northern Soviet army group is playing a supporting role. It's had to shore up its front. It was delayed a little bit, so they don't enter the fight until a few days late. It's under the command of Konstantin Rokossovsky, who has a crazy biography himself.
That is very true.
Where he fell onto the wrong side of the Bolshevik, ideas of who was a traitor and so on. He got put in prison for a while, and now all of a sudden, in the greatest moment in Soviet history, he's commanding an army group. He's back with the Second Belarusian Front.
With lots of teeth missing because they'll be knocked out by the NKVD, yes.
The NKVD is another source of motivation for Soviet soldiers, of course, because they have blocking detachments who are going to fire on you if you retreat, similar to what's going on the German side as well. But I digress about Rokossovsky because he's a fascinating character. The main action is going to happen facing those Seelow Heights, where Zhukov's attacking, and in Konev's sector, crossing another river further south called the Neisse River. And basically, Zhukov runs into all sorts of problems. The area is extremely swampy, as I mentioned, and you have the Germans up on these heights. They're much weaker, but they're dug in. They've had time to prepare their defenses. They do have some quality Wehrmacht troops there. And so what ends up happening is Zhukov tries. The tanks are driving up these steep angles, trying to get up the Seelow Heights. There's some harrowing accounts from like a Georgian tank driver saying, my gunner was hit and there were Panzerfaust guys in holes all around me that I had to drive over them with my tracks and all sorts of crazy stuff. And they don't hardly get anywhere in the first couple of days. So Zhukov commits an error. He then decides, well, I'm under a lot of political pressure, right? Stalin has met with both of them before and said, we need to do this. We need to capture Berlin before those perfidious British and Americans are going to do it, because he's so suspicious and paranoid. And some historians say that he even pits them against each other. He says, you should be faster. There's a race. Whoever goes faster is going to get the prize. Now, there's a debate around that. Some people say that that's overblown. Some people say it's mostly Konev sort of pushing that because he wanted to muscle in on taking the actual city. But be that as it may, whatever the answer to the debate truly is, Zhukov is struggling. And in the 4 days at Seelow, there are all sorts of crazy estimates of how many Soviets are killed, from 30,000 to 60-some thousand. it's essentially a massacre. They do eventually get up on those heights, but it costs them very dearly. Things go better for Konev in the south. He has a much heavier artillery preparation. He doesn't commit the error that Zhukov commits, which is to shove in the two tank armies and create a massive traffic jam in a swamp when the enemy's overlooking your position. And they cross the Neisse River. The Germans are also weaker. Their position's weaker there. So Konev's racing through after the first day, and Zhukov takes 4 days of hard fighting to be able to secure those heights.
And when you look at the Seelow campaign itself, or the fighting at Seelow, it really is a massacre for the Soviets. And as you've explained, it's mainly because of tactical. You might perhaps even just look at the numbers and the figures and operational errors on the Soviet side, because Zhukov really is trying to push through. And of course, both the Germans and the Soviets have identified this part of the entire front line as the absolute key terrain. And the reason for that is very simple. Once you're on the Seelow Heights, and then you can keep pushing due west, this is where you hit Berlin. And not only is it due west, but you already talked about the terrain. You talked about the swamps, the very, very dense woods, very, very bad soils, very sandy. So this area used to be known as the Imperial Sandbox because nothing grows there. It's just sand in that area. But that means it's quite difficult sometimes for vehicles, for example, to go through, even on the once you've reached the heights. And of course, you've got this one road, the R1, the Reichsstraße 1, the Imperial Road number 1, which in the old days connected Aachen, all in the west, which now is very firmly in American hands at that particular stage, all the way leading up to Königsberg. So this is the main artery of Germany going all the way from west to east, running through all the major cities, including Berlin. So once you're up on the heights and you've broken through the German defenses, you can just keep pushing. The Soviets know this. The Germans also know this. And as you've said, Zhukov commits a number of errors because he's pushed into this by Stalin. Stalin say, well, I want you to raise the red flag on the Reichstag on the 1st of May because that's Labor Day, which is very important to the communist regime. So he is under an awful lot of pressure. And the way they do things is really bad. And when you read the German accounts, in a way, if that's the right word, they can't believe their luck because what they're doing is, well, they say it's like a turkey shoot. You've got all these Soviet tanks rolling up towards the Seelow Heights, and they can only use a handful of roads because of the swampy terrain. And the Germans have brought to this defensive line all the anti-aircraft guns from Berlin. So Berlin is completely bare. There is no defense anymore, which, of course, in the end is going to be a problem. The exception of the flag towers, we might be talking about them later. But apart from that, the entire flag Armada, the flag army, has been moved to the Oder front. And you've got all these anti-aircraft guys there, and they are trained in knocking out tanks as well. And according to the German sources, they managed to knock out over 500 tanks within a day. That's an awful lot. And the Soviets suffer, and they keep pushing, and they keep pushing, and they keep pushing. And that is an absolute major problem. The Soviets in the southern sector, as you said, much more successful for many reasons. You already mentioned these. There are a number of very, very famous places there as well. For example, there is a place called Klaßen. In the German High Command was said, well, if Klaßen falls, Berlin will fall. It's an absolutely fascinating little tactical engagement where the German troops in this manor house are encircled. And for the very last time during the war, the Germans managed to fly in and airdrop supplies into the German troops. It's an NCO officer cadet school basically there, all experienced NCOs. You've got the last, you might say, relatively big German tank engagement on the Eastern Front, a number of Panthers driving through. It's fascinating stuff when you look at the tactical level. So there's an awful lot of these things happening. And of course, it's also, when you look at the slightly bigger picture here, again, the Germans fighting in this area, particularly the people who were from this area, they understood the importance of this. It's not only geography, but it's also, for example, it's history again, because this is the Prussian heartland. You're close to Berlin. This is where Prussia was formed. And this whole idea of, I don't believe in the idea of Prussian militarism, another topic to discuss. But of course, there are some elements of this. And yeah, everything that is embodied by Prussian militarism, good or bad, of course, comes from this particular part of the world. So there's one story very, very close to Klaßen on that particular front in Friedersdorf. Someone was buried there, a chap called von der Marwitz, and he was a general of Frederick the Great. And he was ordered to keep a long story very, very short because a completely different period, and I completely digress, but I'm going to finish that thought anyway. So he's ordered to burn down a castle. He's given a direct order by Frederick the Great, and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to obey his order. So he's basically, again, long story cut short, he's kicked out of the army. And in this church in Friedersdorf, even today, you've got his gravestone that says on it, chose disgrace where loyalty did not bring honor. So that's an extremely strong statement. That's a very, very Prussian statement. Everybody in those days knew that statement. It was one of the main slogans internally used by the people of the 20th of July. When they say, well, we have to kill Hitler. So you can see there's all sorts of things happening. And history also weighs on the shoulders of the German soldiers fighting in that particular area.
Yeah, which reminds me, you mentioned a little earlier about this concept of the Volkssturm, goes back to what the Germans have traditionally seen in the national narrative as the wars of liberation against Napoleon. Of course, at the time, it was more complicated than that, since half the German states were fighting with Napoleon. But we're digressing again. But they used these concepts, the concepts of history, for propaganda, quite extensively and to some extent effectively. For example, they shot early in 1945 a movie about 1813, when German civilians rise up in a popular uprising against the foreign invader. And it's not a coincidence that they're choosing that theme to shoot this movie in 1945. The name escapes me now, but
Kolberg. It's called Kolberg.
Yes, Kolberg. And the idea is that, of course, they will motivate people to rise up and resist the Soviets, which doesn't really happen in the way that they envision, of course.
It's a really fascinating one, this whole Kolberg thing, because, well, again, linking it back to the 19th century, why do they choose Kolberg? Because Kolberg was one of the very, very few fortified towns that held out against Napoleon in that particular period. That's why, again, Germans at that stage knew that. They had a stellar cast of actors, so the creme de la creme of the German actors of 1945, 1944, 45 were all there. The most famous one, George. And they also brought an entire division from the Eastern Front as extras, which tells you an awful lot about the importance that they give to this whole project.
Priorities.
Absolutely. So that's absolutely fascinating to look at.
Right. But getting back to our Berlin operation, aside from the propaganda and so on, the battle continues. And after this extremely difficult 4 days on the Seelow Heights, Zhukov's forces do break through. Now, we've been a bit critical of Zhukov, and I think that's fully justified, with the caveat of, the extreme political pressure that he's operating under. That's a limitation in your decision making. But once they break the German defenses, they're off to the races. And the Red Army knows what it's doing by this stage of the war. It's not just a numbers game. I have to say, that's one of my pet peeves about popular discussions about history and on YouTube and so on, is, the Soviets were good for nothing. They just had a lot of stuff. Well, yeah, they had more stuff than the Germans, but they knew what they were doing. By this time, they have a string of victories over several years, including lots of encirclement battles, lots of deep battle operations. It's part of their doctrine, right? Lots of deep penetrations into the rear of German forces. And that's what they're going for here, right? So from the 20th of April, Hitler's birthday, by the way, to the 25th of April, there's what I kind of call the encirclement phase. So the German defenses have been broken. The Red Army is rushing due west towards the city to just encircle it closely around the north. And then Konev has a longer route, but he's coming west and then north towards the city as well. And here's where Stalin sort of erases on his map famously. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but in the meeting, he erases the dividing line west of a certain point and allows Konev to turn north more sharply than the original plan envisioned, to take advantage of his success and to be able to enter the city, which was not part of the original plan for Konev's army group. So you have these two army groups rushing to encircle Berlin, which they eventually do on the 25th. The Germans are in a sort of chaotic retreat. They're losing contact with certain important units. The 56th Panzer Corps, which is a very important formation that's going to be the core of the resistance inside the city when the fighting begins within city limits, it's just incommunicado for a few days. And its commander, General Weidling, is sentenced to death for retreating and sentenced to death for not retreating by different people. It's out of control. So what ends up happening, of course, is the German Ninth Army and part of the German Fourth Panzer Army, they get completely surrounded east of Berlin. And then the city itself also gets surrounded on the 25th. So we have double envelopments happening. And there's a huge pocket created southeast of Berlin called the Halbe Pocket in English and German. The Soviets call it the Frankfurt Guben Group. And so not only do you have this dramatic kind of encirclement of the city, which is now under siege and so on, but you also have this wild encirclement in these forests and swamps and villages southeast of Berlin. You have 200,000 German soldiers and all the civilians trapped there as well, which becomes a complete nightmare. A complete nightmare. No fuel, no ammo, no food, rushing west to try to break out of the pocket. Survival of the cruelest, fittest, or some combination of that. Wounded are the wounded are falling off of the tanks who don't stop and just drive over them. It's completely wild. The story of the Halbe Pocket is a very, I think, underrated aspect of the Battle of Berlin, just for the sheer drama of it.
It's very true. When you go to Halbe, so there is now a very huge cemetery. It's the largest military cemetery on German soil. And you really get a feel for what happened there, because you find an awful lot of military death, of course, but you also find about the same amount of civilian death, including a very, very small girl. Nelly, she was killed and is buried there. And if you go there, if you want to see her, that's the one grave. We can always see lots of toys, lots of flowers, even today. So that was absolutely brutal. It was awful for the Germans in the pocket. And the reason behind that is you've got this moving pocket. They're now trying to break out again. So they were kept in their positions for too long by Hitler. So the Ninth Army and the Busse, they want to break out. They want to retreat from this area to the southeast of Berlin. Hitler says, no, you stay put. You need to fix enemy troops there. And we got more reinforcements, Stein and other people coming in from the west, and they are going to resolve the situation. You stay put. Consequences, as you've already said, they're completely encircled. They're then trying to break through, and they make their way. It's this moving pocket all the way to the west. But now again, you need to think about the terrain. It's flat, but you've got some lakes, and in particular, very, very dense forests. And there are only a number of paths that go through these. And the Soviets now have complete air supremacy. So lots of Soviet planes, spotter planes in the air. They know exactly where the German columns go, because they can only use this very, very small paths, and only a handful that go through these very, very dense pockets. And once they've identified these, they're put in blocking positions, and the Germans have to attack these blocking positions one after the other. And every time they do that, they get weaker and weaker. They lose another tank, another self-propelled gun, and by the end of the whole operation, basically they are storming their accounts without weapons. They're just attacking Soviet barricades, and they're getting mowed down in their drones, because it's just they're running into machine gun fire. So it's absolutely horrendously awful. Some of them then actually managed to link up with troops in the Potsdam area. But yes, the fact that you have the largest military cemetery on German soil in this area is awful. They still find hundreds of bodies every year. So they still haven't cleared this area. And every year in this area and other areas, you also have huge wildfires in the summer, because a lot of the ammunition that is still in the forest goes up, mainly because of the heat. So it's still the scars of the war are still very much there. And I think another point you made really is worth reinforcing. It's this whole thing about the Soviets. When we always say, well, the Soviets, they didn't know what they were doing, they're not good at all, well, they just die, and well, what can they do? They're all stupid. Well, they're not. And you already mentioned the key word here, and that's the deep battle. So the concept of deep battle, because the Soviets understood at the tactical level, they wouldn't be able to outmaneuver a sophisticated army like the German Wehrmacht. But they're not interested in that. What they're interested in is breaking through the enemy lines, achieving the tactical break-in, wiring into a breakthrough, and then unleash the reserves. And that's where you have the operational deep battle. And they do that so very well from 1943 onwards. So I would always say from 1943 onwards, at the operation level of war, in my personal opinion, the Soviet Red Army is probably the best army of the main belligerents in World War II. They do that really well. Take away the obsession with the tactical level. We always tend to look at the tactical level, what happens in the frontline trench, but there's so much more, and the rear areas, the operational thinking behind that. And the Germans are not particularly good at this, whereas the Soviets really, really are.
Yes, they are. And the Germans are on the receiving end of this, of course. And there's no two ways about it. They're in a state of desperation. You can see that at the political level, and you can see that at the military level as well. One thing I wanted to mention before I carry on that thought about Halbe, about the cemetery there. It's also tragically an example of the abuse of history for political purposes, because today that cemetery is considered by some on the far right and some neo-Nazis to be some sort of pilgrimage destination. And that's another scar, let's say, of the war, that the German authorities and German society still have to deal with some of these kinds of uses of those historical sites. But another element of this phase, this encirclement phase, is that the Soviets are conquering or liberating, depending on one's point of view, all sorts of small villages and small towns in the countryside, east and south of Berlin. And as they do, they liberate all sorts of foreigners, all sorts of non-Germans who are there. There are prisoners of war from France, from Belgium, from Italy, because even though Italy fought on the Axis side when they surrendered, their soldiers were then taken prisoner by the Germans. And also, of course, forced laborers, most of them from the Soviet Union or from Poland. So you have these scenes in all sorts of villages and towns of liberation of forced laborers. And Soviet prisoners of war end up getting the rawest deal of all, because they are often immediately conscripted into the unit that liberates them, given a rifle, and sent off with that unit to fight. Now, this is a traumatic experience. Imagine you've been captured in a horrible battle in 1943 or 44. I mean, if it was 41 or 42, you're probably not alive by now. But let's say you've been captured in 1943. You suffer the tribulations and the trauma of a German concentration camp or prisoner of war camp, and then all of a sudden, and forced labor, and now all of a sudden, you have to fight, and you haven't had any training in 2 years. You're weak, you're malnourished, and so on and so forth. So this was quite a tragic experience for many of them.
On the other hand, you might also say, well, they were perhaps the lucky ones, because what happened also very often in the Soviet case is if you were a prisoner of war and were, in inverted commas, liberated, you were thrown into a gulag right away, because as a Soviet soldier, you were not allowed to surrender. So the moment you surrender, you become a betrayer of the motherland, and you basically, in inverted commas, worked for the other side. And so you're a traitor and had to be dealt with. So, you can't really win if you're a Soviet prisoner of war. And of course, also, well, if you are liberated, you are one of the lucky ones, because when you look at what happens to most of the Soviet prisoners of war that were captured in 1941 and perhaps 1942, about 95 to 98% of these had died, mainly because of malnourishment and actively starvation. So it's pretty nasty, yes.
Yes, and on the topic of this sort of historical tragedy and war crime, during this Berlin operation, the Red Army is able to liberate two of the more well-known concentration camps on German territory, Sachsenhausen, which is just north of Berlin, and Ravensbrück, which was a concentration camp for women. Now, to add to the tragedy of it all, before the Red Army is able to reach those camps, the Germans march most of the prisoners, at least nearly all the able-bodied prisoners, they march them away. And many of them die along the way from ill treatment. They're murdered, or they collapse and die from exhaustion or thirst or what have you. In fact, one of the plan for the prisoners of Sachsenhausen was to march them to the Baltic Sea and drown them there. And that's according to the camp commandant, who then revealed this at his trial after the war. So it's not only, that's one of the things I find the most fascinating about this battle. It's not only a military operation. It's got so many more elements that really tie all of the aspects of World War II together, including the cowardice, I would say, it's a strong word, but I'm going to use it, of many of the top-ranking Nazis. There's this phenomenon that occurs as it's clear the Red Army has broken through, called the flight of the golden pheasants, where all these big shots like Himmler, like Göring, like Speer, the Minister for Munitions, who gives these famous interviews after the war and gets a lot of sympathy in the English-speaking world, they leave. They're like, oh, I've got to go and command from Bavaria suddenly, or what have you, right? And they're out of there. And some SS units also do this. There's a Latvian SS unit that just flees for all it's worth, for example, at one stage of the battle. So there is definitely chaos on the German side, and the orders are chaotic that are coming from headquarters. For example, they order, and this was made famous by the movie Downfall, they order Steiner to launch a counterattack from the north. They order Wenck, who's actually much more important, but not as famous because he wasn't talked about as much in the movie. But they order General Wenck to turn his army around, stop fighting the Americans, and to come back and save Berlin. And all of this is just in an absolute mess while the Red Army is racing towards the city.
And when you look at, for example, Sachsenhausen, to go back to that point, it's an absolutely fascinating one, because it shows you again how Berlin in this part of the world is not only about 1945 and the Nazi period, but there's so much more there. Because when the Soviets take over the camp, yes, of course, they liberate, well, the people are still there. You just talked about them. Most are taken on these death marches, as they're known, to actively basically kill them. But then Sachsenhausen becomes first a Soviet and then an East German concentration camp. And when you want to visit it today, you can still see the Soviet barracks there as well. So you can see there's all sorts of even bigger upheaval and confusion in that particular part of the world. So it's really, really, really fascinating. And yeah, the foreign workers, you talked about that. You've got the foreign workers being liberated. What are you going to do? Perhaps if you are an Eastern one, and perhaps even from an Eastern SS unit as well, even though they're of course not forced labor, but there's something else, you might be able to blend in, throw away uniform, put on something else and start talking Russian again. That's much more difficult for other people. So you've got all these displaced people walking around. Of course, a number of people of the Nazi, well, you call them the golden pheasants, they were trying to hide within this wave. It doesn't really work. Himmler's a perfect example. He's then later up in the north, close to Hamburg. He's then basically caught and then commits suicide. All sorts of these things, got hundreds of thousands, millions of displaced people running around this area. And of course, you also have within Berlin itself an awful lot of that going on. And not only do you have displaced people there, but what you also find, of course, is other nationalities. And of course, these are the ones fighting for the Germans in their Waffen-SS uniforms. And I think that's also a fascinating aspect that is very often forgotten when we talk about World War II. Because no one, of course, after 1945 would admit that they would fight with the Nazis against the Soviet Union. But actually, when you look at the statistics, in 1943, about a third of all the troops fighting on the Eastern Front against communism are not German. You've got very large contingents, you've got very small contingents, and Berlin, again, is perhaps the perfect example, because you already mentioned them, you've got the Nordland division, so that's mainly Scandinavians, you've got guys from the Charlemagne division, so these are French volunteers. So, to say quite flippantly, so the last defenders of Hitler while he was fighting his bunker were French volunteers fighting for Hitler. So there's that aspect as well, which is quite often overlooked. And of course, as I said, no one really wants to talk about this after 1945. For these guys, it's much more difficult because you can't really blend in anymore. So you basically have to fight to the finish because you can't go home. You'll be treated as a Nazi traitor. You don't want to be captured by the Soviets. The best thing you could do if you're fluent in German, which most of these guys were, and try to blend in with the population and then try to go wherever, because you can't go back home. So not a nice situation for these people to be in. Of course, they chose to be in this situation by volunteering for the Waffen-SS. But again, if you start thinking this through from a personal, psychological level, that's quite something.
No question. And another tragedy resulting from this period and the political mix that comes afterwards with the Cold War and so on is that many of those foreign SS volunteers who did end up at some stage returning to their home country, some were punished, some were even executed, but most end up getting off relatively easily and living relatively normal lives, despite the fact that some of them may have and certainly did commit some of the many atrocities in the battle. And now before we really get into the siege phase of the battle, the last phase when they're fighting in the city itself, I want to summarize a little bit, because we can't really talk about this operation as just a military one, as we say. There's too much else going on, political and war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there's a mass of atrocities that occurred during this campaign. We've referred to some of them already so far. There's mass looting and stealing by both sides. I mean, I think we in the English-speaking world mostly hear about the Soviet looting, which was partly motivated by poverty. Not exclusively, of course, but partly. They were sending things home like glass for windows and light bulbs and all that kind of thing. But the Germans also loot. They loot their own food stores, they loot stores, private civilian stores. Of course, German civilians also try to loot because they're hungry and there's a shortage of food. The Germans decide to kill a bunch of political prisoners. Since the jig is clearly up, they don't want to go out quietly. They execute a whole bunch of German political prisoners being held at the Plötzensee prison near Berlin, for example. We mentioned the death marches. We mentioned the executions of Soviet prisoners of war. And of course, the executions of many of those foreign laborers. They kill over 100 Italian prisoners of war, shoot them all near Treuenbrietzen, and so on and so forth. Of course, the most well-known atrocity associated with the Battle of Berlin is sexual violence. It's rape by Red Army soldiers against mostly German civilian women, but not exclusively. There are many cases where they raped liberated forced laborers, be they Soviet women, Polish women, Jewish women, or what have you. There's a well-known memoir by a German journalist, a pre-war journalist who was very critical of the Nazi regime, but she kept a diary during the Battle of Berlin, and she was the victim of multiple rapes, and it's called A Woman in Berlin. I really recommend that, even if you're not a hardcore history person, which I can't really imagine if you're listening to this podcast, but still, that is an absolutely spellbinding and harrowing account of a woman's experience. It's genuine. They know who she was, even though she wanted to keep her identity a secret. Now, part of that is, of course, considered by some Soviets to be payback for the mass rape of Soviet women that occurred in the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, that doesn't change the nature, the impact of the crime on the, according to estimates, 100 to 130,000 German women in Berlin who were raped. Of course, the total number is much higher, but that includes East Prussia and the provinces where before the Soviets half-heartedly attempted to crack down. So, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. Otherwise, we will move on to the siege phase of the battle.
I think I've got 1 or 2 points because I think it's really, really an important one. And quite often we tend to, well, not we, because we're talking about this, but generally speaking, people looking at the Battle of Berlin, they gloss over this because it's nothing that's not the fighting bit. So no one seems to be interested. Everyone says, yes, of course there was rape, but then basically leave it at this. What I find perhaps even worse than the raping by the Soviet soldiers is, and you already alluded to it, is the way some German units and also sometimes civilians behaved against their own people. There's one episode where a Waffen-SS unit basically burns an entire bunker because they put out a white flag and say, "Well, we teach you how to surrender," and then basically just kill them all. I think this sheer disregard for life is basically that. I find that even hard to understand. Of course, it all makes perfect sense from a Nazi ideology point of view, and Hitler talks about this. He says, "Well, there's no need. German people. Well, they don't have to survive because they've proven to be weaker, and the future belongs to the Slavs." So that's the famous Nero order that he sends out, where he says that everything in Germany should be destroyed, bridges and power station, all these things. So I think that's really, really, really awful. And when you look at the looting, perhaps the famous story here, the famous examples, of course, what you might perhaps say is arguably one of the most famous pictures of the Second World War, and that's the picture of the Soviet soldiers raising the red flag on top of the Reichstag. So the picture that we see was staged anyway. The story, I don't want to go into detail now, was all a bit more complex and complicated. So they staged this. They take the picture. They send it back to Moscow, say, "Well, publish it all over the world. We have won the war. It's the Soviet Union. We've got to the center of Nazism, and we defeated them." And then someone looks at the picture and says, "We can't really use this." And I say, "Well, why can't we use it? It's a brilliant picture, isn't it? It shows everything, even the Brandenburg Gate in the back. So what else do you want?" Well, just look at the arm of the one officer holding the other guy, giving him support. And he's wearing 3 watches on his wrist because obviously he looted them. So they had to do a little bit of 1945 Photoshop magic, and then they could publish it. So there is that as well. It's a famous story.
Yes, it's a famous story. And the picture was taken by a very, very famous Soviet photographer, Yevgeny Khaldei. And watches were a prestige item because the Soviet Union was so poor that most of these guys would have never been able to afford a watch in their entire lives. And so it makes it that much more appealing, though, of course, it doesn't necessarily justify it. It helps us to understand not all the looting was kind of, some animal instinct. It's the result of an army of very, very poor people finding themselves in a much, much wealthier surrounding that they've never seen before and will never see again. And this is something that does fuel some Soviet anger and motivation. Once they enter Central Europe, they think to themselves, the Germans already had everything. Why would they come to us and kill and rape and loot and destroy our country? They already are living in the lap of luxury. I've read an account along those lines.
Well, I have to say, I had exactly the same feeling when I was on my first trip to Stalingrad, Monday, Volgograd. When you fly down from Moscow, you look out the window and all you see is this flat, open steppe country. What did they actually want here, the Germans? So who would volunteer to become a settler here when you're somewhere a relatively wealthy farmer in Westphalia or something like this? It's just absolutely barking mad. Yeah, barking mad.
The perils of ideology. In any case, we are running far beyond our usual time, but for one, I'm not bored. I hope that holds for you listeners out there as well. We're going to now dive into the final phase, the siege phase of the battle, which lasts from April 26th, after Berlin is surrounded, up until May 2nd, the day that the Berlin garrison surrenders. All sorts of things happen during this time period. It's a week on paper, but it must have seemed like a lifetime for everyone involved. The fighting is very difficult, not because the Germans are particularly strong. Estimates vary, but they probably only have less than 100,000 men and maybe 60 tanks in the entire city. And most of those men are not top quality, right? We have some 56th Corps, but that's about it. They have Navy troops, they have Luftwaffe troops in a ground role. They have a few foreign SS fighters still around, as we've mentioned. The problem is the city is gigantic. It's crisscrossed by raised railway lines. There's all sorts of railway junctions and stations. Embankments everywhere. There's canals crisscrossing through the city. There's the Spree River, big river that winds, big by European standards. Here I am speaking like a Canadian. Small by Soviet or Canadian standards, but a substantial river when it's running right through the middle of a city. And of course, they have this circular ring going around the core of the city for the trains that is a main defensive line as well. And the city's already in ruins. Not only from Soviet artillery, but from a couple of years of pretty regular and heavy Western Allied bombing. So the ruins are to the Germans' advantage in terms of defending. So even if you're outgunned, like they use the swamps and forests outside of Berlin, you can use the ruined urban landscape to defend. This means the Soviets, they do commit some mistakes. They bunch up the tanks, for example, especially at the beginning. Some say they're doing this because Konev and Zhukov are, competing and trying to cut each other off at the risk of friendly fire, of which there is some. Eventually, Konev is ordered to withdraw to avoid confusion. But despite the Soviet superiority in firepower, it's heavy going. And they develop, they have some experience in urban combat, especially one particular general, Chuikov. He's considered kind of an urban warfare expert. They've fought, of course, urban warfare in Stalingrad, more recently urban warfare in Posen, which today is Poznan in Poland. So they do have an idea what they're doing. They have sort of combined arms urban warfare teams to storm different positions, different city blocks. You'll have infantry with submachine guns and grenades. You'll have engineers with explosives to blow holes in walls to get access from different sides. You'll have small anti-aircraft guns used in a ground support role. You'll have a self-propelled gun like an Su-76, for example, which is an open-top, maneuverable, smaller, self-propelled 76 millimeter gun. You might have then a tank. You'll have flamethrowers. And you need to use these elements all together to be able to capture these extremely difficult piles of rubble or big, thick, old 19th century buildings.
And I think here's is a huge and fundamental difference to what armies would normally do today. So when you take groups, for example, army groups to Berlin and look at urban fighting, it's very, very difficult for them to take the modern chip out and put a 1945 chip in, where you have these fire teams, where you have these small groups. And as you already said, you have self-propelled guns, you've got artillery that in a direct fire role blasts out German pockets of resistance. That's nothing that people would hopefully do today, or at least that you wouldn't find in the doctrine these days. Well, you never know what might happen in the future, but at the moment, that's not what people would be doing. So it's a completely different way of fighting, because there's still mass casualties on both sides. We can talk about casualties perhaps a little bit later. But it's a big, big problem. You're absolutely right. So how do you fight your way through this big, huge city? And as the Soviets are closing in, and they laughed their way across the first defensive line. You already talked about this. They then hit the S-Bahn ring, which is the second line of defense. And then, of course, once they get into the citadel, so the core of the German defense, where the Germans can make use of these waterways, the Landwehrkanal, all these other things that they've got there, it's really, really difficult for the Soviets. And yes, the Soviets have got much, much better at fighting in the urban terrain. You mentioned Chuikov, very, very famous example. You mentioned Stalingrad. He's actually buried there in Stalingrad now, because that's where he wanted to be buried. That's the place that made him. The city is in ruins. The last big air raid is actually on the 20th of April, 1945. So this is what they called the birthday present by the Western Allies for Hitler. And remember what I said earlier, at this stage, the entire flak, the anti-aircraft guns, had been moved to the Oder front. By this stage, most of them had been lost. So it's basically a defenseless city. And so they keep bombing it. Berlin is the most heavily bombed city in Germany. The advantage for the Germans and the people from Berlin is that the streets and the boulevards are quite wide. So the bombers do not manage to create the firestorm like in many other places like Hamburg or Dresden or Lübeck. So even though it is very heavily bombed, it doesn't burn out like other places. So that's, if you want to see that as an advantage of the bombing war for the Germans, there is one. And when you then look at what the Soviets do, so in the short period of the fighting for the city itself, the Soviets managed to fire as much in weight ordnance into Berlin, so it's mainly artillery shells, into Berlin as the Allies had dropped in over 4 years or nearly 5 years in an air war. So you can see, again, this is something that we don't talk about, but the sheer weight of firepower that the Soviets have. And of course, again, on the 20th of April, it's the first time that the center of Berlin is hit by artillery fire. And Hitler's very confused and say, well, where are these bombers coming from? And they say, well, these are not bombers, that's artillery. Again, it's a downfall, it's the film. You probably have all seen this. And that, of course, all has, again, an impact. We talked about the civilians a lot. So when you get the civilians again, how do you cope with this as a civilian sitting in a cellar? And there are absolutely awful stories again for people who manage to find their ways into one of these big bunkers. And there's still quite a few standing. One at Analtabano, for example, you've got one, the flag towers. You've got opposite the flag towers, got an air raid shelter that you can visit. So there's still these scars again of the war are still very, very much there. And when you listen to some of these stories that happened there, so you've got, let's take Analtabano. So that's a shelter built for the staff and the passengers who go through what at that stage was Berlin's largest railway station. Air raid happens, you go in there, you stay for about 2 or 3 hours, then you go out and hopefully go on your train, go wherever you need to go. Towards the end, there are accounts of people staying in the bunker for 5 or 7 days. And these bunkers are, let's say, built for perhaps 500 to 1,000 people. Analtabano was slightly larger. But multiply that by at least 10. Because that's the amount of people you find in there. And they don't stay in there for an hour or 2 or 3, but for days and days and days. Just think about the consequence of that. Not enough air. You can't really use the toilets. There are accounts where people were having water bottles were being brought in and were handed to the people at the very front. And by the time they reached the back, the water in there had turned green. So that's how the conditions, how awful they were. So just think about the relief in many ways when the battle is declared over, even though it's lost, but at least you can come out and you know you've survived. Not a particularly nice experience.
Indeed. And I mean, this experience was, of course, made worse by the lack of planning on the part of the Nazi regime. They don't evacuate the civilians before the battle, and so on and so forth. And I must say, for all the crimes that the Red Army committed against German civilians during the battle, they do, once they take control of major parts of the city, they do start restoring utility services. They do distribute food. One particular Red Army general is associated with this more than the others, General Berzarin. In fact, I used to live a 2-minute walk from Berzarin Square in former East Berlin.
Good area.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool area. In fact, I used to live on what was called after the war in occupied East Berlin, right? Was called Stalinallee, so Stalin Street, basically, which has now been renamed. But that's another digression. So I love those.
But it's worth visiting.
Indeed, it is worth visiting because it's surrounded by monumental Eastern German sort of socialist architecture. It's where they had their May Day parades and Victory Day parades. Of course, the buildings were cheap as anything and not very well made, but they looked relatively nice. So it was a bit of
by socialist standards, they were very, very good.
Yeah, in those days, yes. But I wanted to mention a couple of other elements related to this urban fighting. One of them, of course, is the famous flak towers. These are anti-aircraft towers. They're absolutely monumental behemoths that were built. There were several pairs in Berlin. They also built some in Hamburg and in Vienna. And I don't want to make this all about me, but I also lived 50 meters from one of the flak towers in Vienna, which was awesome. And you can visit it. It's in a public park.
I have to say, that part of Vienna is the nicer part than of Berlin where you lived. So that's
true.
quite a fancy part of Vienna, isn't it? Yes,
that
absolutely.
Is true.
I think that's why they put the bunker there in the first place, in that square, just to show the bourgeoisie. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
What happens is, of course, there's no more use for these flak towers in Berlin to shoot at aircraft. I mean, the Red Air Force does a few raids, but it's not the same. And they're quite heavily armed, so they are used to fire on ground targets on pre-registered areas. There's a famous incident where the Red Army is trying to cross the Moltke Bridge, cross the Spree River to attack the Reichstag. So today the Bundestag, the German parliament building, which the Soviets make into a big propaganda symbol that we need to capture this. It's the heart of Berlin and so on. Actually, it's completely unimportant to the Nazi regime. It hasn't been used in years. It's actually a symbol of German democracy, of which the Nazis were not really fans. So nonetheless, they expend a lot of energy and lives trying to cross the river to attack the Reichstag. And the flak towers fire on this Moltke Bridge, and they take out a bunch of tanks as they're trying to cross and so on and so forth. So the flak towers are not only hellish shelters in their bases for civilians, but they are a military factor in the fighting as well. And they're not really destructible. They surrender because the city's basically lost. They don't surrender because the Soviets are able to break into them or anything like that. It's quite an interesting story. And you can still visit one of the flak towers today. It's open to public visits.
Absolutely. So the flak towers is a fascinating story. As I say, you can visit one of those. You had 3 in the center of Berlin. So one is at Bahnhof Zoo, the zoo station, which is also the center of the headquarters of the Air Force division, so the flak division in Berlin. You then have one at Humboldt-Hain, that's the one you already mentioned that you can still visit, and then you've got one at Volkspark Friedrichshain. And the history of these after the war is really interesting. So during the war, you already mentioned it, they can't be seized. For example, the Humboldt one, it only surrenders after they're told that officially Berlin has now surrendered on the 2nd of May. Only then they come out and the Soviets basically bypass it. They try to seize it once, they give up because they know there's too much resistance. And these 3 flak towers really become the heart of the resistance for Berlin. As you said, direct fire roll. They're very, very tall. They're very high. So you've got a very, very good view over the city. You can fire in direct fire support roads, for example, onto the Moltke Bridge. I come back to the Moltke Bridge maybe in a minute. And what's really interesting, what happens to these after the war, because you say they're indestructible. So the one at Zoo is pretty much blown up and destroyed because there wasn't all much around at the time that was still left standing. They put lots of explosive in and that was it. However, that took quite some time because the first time they tried to do so, it's the British now, because the British zone of occupation. They put lots of explosives in there, and they invite the entire Berlin population to watch how we're getting rid of the symbol of Nazism. They basically pull the trigger or whatever they do, and about 1,000 tons of TNT go boof, lots of smoke. The big rumble, and about 2 minutes later, when the dust has settled, the bunker is still there. Well, that's a bit embarrassing. So they do the same thing again a week later or so, and exactly the same thing happens, even though they put more explosives in. So what they then do the next time round is in the middle of the night, put even more explosives in and then blow this thing up. Because if this doesn't go well now, at least we don't have all these visitors. And someone said, of course you can't destruct it because it's made in Germany. That was someone had written on it in those days. And then because they do it in the middle of the night and no one's told about it, and the bang and the blast is so big, so all of the remaining windows basically in all of Berlin are completely shattered, which of course leads to lots of complaints. You then have got the one at Humboldt-Hain, which is partly cracked. So they try to blow it up. Where they also, by the way, find an awful lot of art because a lot of the art from the Berlin museums was put in there, which strangely enough re-emerged about 60 years later, all in Moscow. Surprise, surprise. And that's covered up. That's now part of the park, and it's basically a mount. Only the very, very top, the last meter or so, is still visible. And then you've got the one at Humboldt-Hain, you mentioned it, where you can go on top. You still get a fee for it, but it's only about a third of what had been there, because they couldn't really blow it up because it was too close to the S-Bahn station, so they didn't want to destroy that. And the Molke Bridge, just briefly, because you mentioned it, again, is an absolutely fascinating example of what happens. The propaganda, very important, all part of the build-up for the storming of the Reichstag, which, as you've said, well, basically stood empty since 1933. Nothing happened in there. So all the famous Hitler speeches during the war don't happen there, but happen in the Kroll Opera, which is on the other side of the square. Doesn't exist anymore. It's roughly, very roughly, where you find the Chancellery today, in that area. But when you just look at the fighting for the bridge itself, so the Soviets use an entire corps of soldiers. So that's 2 divisions. If you think about this, you already said it, well, Soviet formations tend to be slightly smaller than Western ones. That is very true. So corps divisions about 10,000 men. Most of these guys are actually the liberated prisoners of war that you already mentioned. But just think about the sheer size. So that's about 20 to 25,000 people attacking one bridge. If you put that into perspective, that is pretty much at least half, probably 2/3, perhaps even the entire army of most Western European countries fighting for one bridge. And you can see how tactically driven they are, because the corps commander is leaning out of a window, which is about 100 meters away from that particular bridge, or basically cheering his guys on, well, go and seize the bridge. And then the tactical action, again, is also very interesting, because it's very brutal, very, very bloody. But in the end, they managed to seize the bridge and then storm across towards the Reichstag.
Yes, and that always reminds me of a letter. I don't have it here to quote from it, but a very touching letter written by a Soviet soldier. Vladimir Periverzev was his name, to his wife. And he's saying, I'm looking across the square at the Reichstag. We've almost got the job done, etc., etc. And then, of course, he's killed while attempting to storm the Reichstag on the day after writing that letter.
And exactly at the same time, you've got accounts from the German side as well, of course. And there is a very, very good account from a Hitler Youth guy who's used as a runner exactly at the same time as this is happening. So the Soviets are building up for the attack onto the Reichstag. And he goes into the Reichstag because he has to transmit a message, hand over whatever it was, an order or so. And it's also, again, this whole weirdness of the fighting. So as you came in there, and it was all barricaded up, and you had about, no one really knows exactly, probably some in the region of about 2,000 SS men defending it. But he said the interesting thing was, only, if you look at the Reichstag, only the left-hand side was being defended. The right-hand side, there was nothing there. The only thing that was in there was the kitchen staff. So that's where he would go to get his sandwiches before he would run out again. So it's really bizarre. And then again, the cruelty of the war. He then, one of his missions, he runs into the remains of the Adlon Hotel, rebuilt today, Berlin's most famous hotel. If you haven't heard of it, well, just think Michael Jackson holding his baby over the balustrade. That's the Adlon Hotel. And he goes in there, and that, of course, was also the main dressing stations for the Germans. And he writes about this, where he says he went in there, and he had this one person who was very badly wounded, and so one of the nurses just went there and shot him in the head. And he said, well, that was the only thing they could do. There was nothing else. And again, this sheer brutality, it's quite something that you experience on both sides. That's why you have the mountain casualties.
Absolutely harrowing scenes in those final days and hours before the city is surrendered on May 2nd. Of course, that includes just a few hundred meters away from the Reichstag, the suicide of Hitler in the bunker. And yes, folks, if you're under any sort of other impression, no. He shot himself. It's well documented by multiple historians, all sorts of documentation, forensic stuff about bones and all the rest of it that made it to Moscow and so on. There was an infamous documentary a few years ago called Hunting Hitler, where they tried to really, really suggest, very strongly suggest, without actually saying so, that he went to Argentina or something like that. They're looking for the clickbait, I'm sorry to say. He ended up dead in that bunker, and that's one of the seminal moments of this final phase, this siege phase of the battle. Dönitz becomes president. Goebbels briefly becomes chancellor before he kills himself and his family and his kids and everything. So this is all happening in these final days, these final hours. There's a couple of dramatic breakout attempts by a couple of different groups. They don't go particularly well. Some people do make it out. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal sort of secretary, personal advisor, he ends up being killed in one of the breakout attempts. Traudl Junge, one of Hitler's administrative staff secretaries, she gets out and then goes on to write a memoir that is used as the basis of this Downfall movie from 2004, 2005 or so. So all sorts of wild scenes. In the end, the city is surrendered. The war ends a week later. Estimates vary because it's very hard in this kind of chaotic situation for historians to get a grasp on how many people were killed in the operation, in the battle. Up to 100,000 German military dead is what I've more often come across. At least 80,000 Soviet dead, although that estimate is probably quite conservative. And then the estimates vary in terms of civilian dead from 20 to 100,000. So it's really all over the place. I think that's a reflection of the chaos, of the tragedy, of the crimes that many of which we're never going to know about, actually. That's lost to kind of the mists of history. You can get a little sense of the battle today. We've mentioned that the scars are still there. Near the Moltke Bridge, there's still an old statue of a griffin. On the corners of the bridge, there are these griffin statues, and there's one that was not restored, and it's below the bridge. If you just go down the stairs there, and you'll see it's completely racked with battle damage, as are many other places in the city. You can see all sorts of pock marks and so on and so forth. It adds, I think, to the mystique, to the drama of the battle. Any closing thoughts, Matthias?
Well, I think perhaps the interesting one is also about the legacy of the battle. I mean, again, this is a huge one. You could talk about this forever, and we've run over time, and probably people's patience is running low and out by the stage. So I keep it very, very short. But maybe just use the Führerbunker again as an example, because you talked about this. I mean, in many ways, that's the perfect embodiment of the legacy of Nazism and the Battle of Berlin. Because to most Berliners, perhaps even today, it doesn't really mean an awful lot. So up to whenever the World Cup was in Germany, I'm not a football person. Was it 2014? No, 2006, wasn't it? My God, I don't know.
2006.
2006. Up to that stage, you went to where the Führerbunker was. There was nothing there. It was basically, it's a car park. It still is a car park today. And it was in 2006, because of the World Cup, that they put at least an information board up. Since that day, I've been going there ever since. Well, I knew where it was, but you had to know. Unless you knew, you didn't know, and no one told you. And now you've got all these groups, mainly English-speaking ones actually, who go there and have a look at the Führerbunker. The German authorities didn't want to advertise this because they thought, a bit like Halbe, that might become some sort of holy ground for the wrong sort of type of people. But now it's there, and you can go there, you can look at it, and it's still a car park. But it hasn't, to lots of people, it hasn't lost its mystique. Every tour I do to Berlin, you have to go to the Führerbunker. I mean, I talk about lots of different things, mainly, again, the military aspects or what have you, but it's an integral part of every tour of Berlin, because everyone wants to feel this little bit of Nazi mystique that is still there.
Well, folks, that was a Herculean podcast, I would say. I had a great time, Matthias. I hope you did as well. And I hope you all listening out there did as well. Of course, there's many things we could have explored that are a part of the whole story of Berlin during the war and the Berlin operation. Leave us a comment on this podcast. Did you like it? Why did you like it? Those are your two options. Or you can ask us a question or make a suggestion for a future podcast topic. It's been great fun. And until next time. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.